My brother stood in our mother's empty living room, looking at the small pile of her belongings we had sorted into boxes, and said, in a tired, dismissive voice, that she had left nothing behind worth fighting over. "It's just old furniture and some jewelry that's probably not even real," he said. "I don't know why you're so upset about all this, Marisol. There's nothing here worth getting emotional about." I did not argue with him. I simply held her old wooden jewelry box a little tighter against my chest and said, quietly, that I would take care of sorting through the rest myself. What my brother did not know, what almost nobody in our family knew, was that our mother had left behind something else entirely. A small metal key, hidden inside the lining of that same jewelry box, a key that belonged to a safety deposit box at a bank across town, one that only my name was listed on, one my mother had set up quietly, years earlier, without telling anyone but me. My name is Marisol Fenwick. I am 52 years old. My mother's name was Cordelia. And this is the story of what I found inside that box, and what it finally taught my whole family about the woman we thought we already understood completely. I want to start at the beginning, because I think it will help explain everything that came after. My mother, Cordelia Ashgrove, grew up poor, the daughter of a coal miner in a small mountain town, one of 6 children raised in a house with barely enough room for all of them to sleep comfortably. She often told me, when I was young, that she had learned early in life to value quiet, careful saving over any kind of visible display, because in her childhood home, anything extra you managed to save was the only real protection you had against the next hard winter. She married my father, Osric Fenwick, when she was 20 years old. My father worked as a postal carrier for nearly 35 years, a steady, modest job that never made us wealthy, but always kept a roof over our heads and food on our table. My parents raised 2 children together, my older brother, Halston, born 4 years before me, and myself. I want to describe my mother honestly, because I think it matters for understanding this whole story. She was a quiet woman, not the kind who ever raised her voice or made a big scene about anything. She showed love through small, practical acts, a warm meal always ready when you came home, a careful mending of a torn shirt rather than simply throwing it away, a steady, patient presence at every important moment of my life, even when she did not always know exactly what to say out loud. Halston and I grew up close as children, though we developed, as we got older, quite different personalities. Halston was more like our father in some ways, practical and a little impatient, always wanting to move quickly from one thing to the next. I took after our mother, more closely, quieter, more sentimental, more likely to sit with a memory a little longer before moving forward. I remember one particular afternoon from my childhood that captures this difference well. I was perhaps 8 years old, and Halston 12, and our mother had taken us both to help her sort through a box of old photographs from her own childhood, ones that had recently arrived after her own mother passed away. Halston grew restless within minutes, eager to get back outside to play, while I sat beside our mother for nearly 2 hours, asking question after question about each photograph, who the people were, what their lives had been like, why she had kept certain pictures and not others. I remember her smiling at me, that same quiet, patient smile she always wore, and saying, "You have a good heart for slow things, Marisol. Don't ever let anyone convince you that's a weakness." I did not fully understand what she meant at the time, though I have thought about that comment often in the years since, especially after everything that happened with the safety deposit box. My father passed away when I was 34 years old, from a sudden illness that took him quickly. My mother, only 58 at the time, found herself a widow considerably earlier than she had ever expected. I remember worrying, in those early months after his death, about how she would manage financially, given how modest my father's pension actually was. What I did not fully understand at the time was that my mother had been quietly saving money throughout their entire marriage in small, careful amounts that never showed themselves in any visible way. She had never once splurged on anything extravagant. She clipped coupons her whole life, even after my father's pension made such careful frugality less strictly necessary. She kept the same modest house for decades, never once suggesting they move somewhere larger or fancier, even when some of her friends and neighbors moved into bigger homes as their own families grew more prosperous over the years. I want to explain, honestly, that I did not fully appreciate this quiet frugality at the time, and neither did Halston. We both, I think, quietly assumed, without ever examining it too closely, that our mother simply lived modestly because that was all her circumstances allowed, rather than understanding it as a deliberate, careful choice she was making, year after year, for reasons that would only become clear much later. About 8 years before my mother passed, when I was in my mid-40s, she called me one afternoon and asked if I would come by the house alone, without Halston, for what she described only as something important she wanted to discuss. I remember sitting with her at her kitchen table that afternoon, the same table where I had done my childhood homework decades earlier, while she explained something that surprised me deeply at the time. She told me she had, over the many years since my father's passing, and even during some of the earlier years of their marriage, quietly built up a modest but meaningful amount of savings, money she had never spent, never mentioned, and never let show itself in any visible way in her daily life. She explained that she had recently opened a safety deposit box at a bank across town, and that she wanted to place me, and only me, as the person listed with access to that box. I asked her, gently, why she wanted to keep this private from Halston. I want to explain her answer carefully, because I think it reveals something important about who my mother truly was, and about the complicated dynamics within our own small family that I had not always let myself see clearly. Your brother, she told me, choosing her words carefully, has always struggled more than you have with patience, and with understanding the value of something that isn't immediately visible or spendable. I love him just as much as I love you, Marisol. Please understand that clearly. But I worry, if I left this box jointly to both of you, or told him about it now while I'm still alive, that it might create pressure, arguments, an urgency about the money itself that I don't want hovering over our family while I'm still here to enjoy my time with both of you. I trust you to handle it carefully, when the time comes, in a way that's fair to everyone, including him. I simply don't trust the conversation to go smoothly if I try to have it directly with both of you together, not with how differently the two of you have always approached money and patience. I remember sitting quietly for a moment after she said this, absorbing the weight of what she was actually asking of me. What if I get it wrong? I asked her honestly. What if, when the time comes, I don't know how to divide things the way you would have wanted? She reached across the table and took my hand, the same way she had done countless times throughout my childhood, whenever I was worried about something. You won't get it wrong, she said simply. I've watched you your whole life, Marisol, handling difficult, patient things with more care than almost anyone I know. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm simply asking you to be exactly who you already are when the time finally comes. I did not fully understand, at the time, exactly what she meant by this, though I agreed to keep the matter private, exactly as she asked. I signed the necessary paperwork at the bank a few weeks later, becoming the sole authorized person on that safety deposit box, though I still did not know, even then, exactly what she had placed inside it. Over the following 8 years, my mother's health remained relatively stable, and life continued much as it always had. She lived alone in the same modest house, visited often by both Halston and me, though I want to be honest that Halston's visits grew somewhat less frequent as the years went on, partly due to his own busy life with his wife and children, and partly, I think, due to a certain restlessness he had always carried, a discomfort with quiet, uneventful visits that did not always come easily to him. I want to be fair to Halston in this story, because I do not believe he was ever truly a bad son, or a bad brother. He loved our mother in his own way, and he showed up for the big moments, the holidays, the important family gatherings. But he was never especially patient with the smaller, quieter moments of caring for an aging parent, the long afternoons of simply sitting together, listening to old stories, helping sort through decades of accumulated belongings. That kind of patient, unhurried presence had always fallen more naturally to me. My mother passed away this past winter, peacefully, in her sleep, at the age of 74. It was, in many ways, as gentle an ending as any of us could have hoped for, though the grief that followed was, of course, still deeply painful for both Halston and me. In the weeks after her funeral, Halston and I began the difficult, familiar task of sorting through her house and belongings, the same task so many adult children eventually face after losing a parent. It was during this process, sorting through her modest furniture, her simple jewelry, her closets full of carefully mended clothing, that Halston made the comment that opens this story. We were standing in her living room one afternoon, surrounded by boxes, sorting through what felt like an overwhelming amount of small, ordinary belongings, each one carrying its own quiet weight of memory for me, though clearly feeling like simply a tiring chore to my brother. "It's just old furniture and some jewelry that's probably not even real," Halston said, gesturing around the room with obvious exhaustion in his voice. "I don't know why you're so upset about all this, Marisol. There's nothing here worth getting emotional about. Mom left nothing behind worth fighting over. Let's just get through this as quickly as we can." I remember feeling a sharp, quiet hurt at that comment, though I did not argue with him in the moment. I simply picked up our mother's small wooden jewelry box, the one that had sat on her dresser my entire childhood, and held it a little tighter against my chest. I want to explain what I was actually feeling in that moment, because I think it matters. Part of my hurt was simple grief, the raw, tender grief of losing a mother, made worse by watching my brother move through her belongings with an impatience that felt, to me, disrespectful of everything those small, ordinary objects actually represented. But part of my hurt, if I am honest, was also the quiet knowledge, sitting there in my chest, that Halston had no idea what he was actually saying, no idea that our mother had, in fact, left behind something significant, something he could not yet see. I did not tell him about the safety deposit box that day. I want to explain why, because I think it matters for understanding the rest of this story. I had not yet, myself, actually visited the box since our mother's passing. I had been putting it off, honestly, partly out of grief and partly out of a quiet uncertainty about exactly what I would find inside and how I should handle whatever it turned out to be once I finally opened it. About a week after that difficult afternoon sorting through the living room, once Halston had returned home to his own family for a few days, I finally drove to the bank alone. Carrying the small metal key I had discovered hidden inside the lining of my mother's jewelry box, tucked carefully behind a small flap of fabric I might easily have missed if I had not, by some instinct, run my fingers carefully along every inch of that box while sorting through it. I want to describe what I found inside that safety deposit box carefully, because I think the details matter for understanding the full shape of what my mother had quietly built over so many years, without either of her children ever fully realizing it. Inside the box, I found several things. First, a stack of savings bonds, carefully organized by purchase date, some of them dating back over 30 years, to shortly after my father first passed away. Second, a small folder containing statements from an investment account I had never known existed, one my mother had apparently opened quietly in her late 50s, working with a financial advisor named Bartholomew Ashcroft, whose name I recognized only vaguely from an old business card I remembered seeing once on her kitchen counter, years earlier, without ever thinking much about it at the time. Third, and most surprising of all, I found a handwritten letter, folded carefully inside an envelope with my name written on the front in my mother's familiar, careful handwriting. I want to share, briefly, what that letter contained, because I think it explains everything my mother had been quietly building toward all those years. She wrote that after my father passed, she had made a private decision to live as modestly as she possibly could, not out of pure necessity, but out of a deliberate choice to save and invest whatever she could manage, month after month, year after year, building something meaningful she intended to eventually leave behind for both her children. She explained that she had chosen to keep this saving private, rather than discussing it openly with either of us, because she did not want either Halston or me making different life decisions, different levels of effort or ambition, based on an expectation of a future inheritance. She wanted us, she wrote, to build our own lives fully on our own merits, without the shadow of expected money influencing the choices we made along the way. She explained, too, why she had chosen to place only my name on the safety deposit box rather than both of ours jointly. She wrote that she trusted me, based on years of watching how I handled difficult, patient tasks throughout my life, to eventually divide what she had built fairly and thoughtfully between Halston and myself, in a way that considered not just an equal split of numbers, but the actual real needs and circumstances of both our lives. She specifically asked me to use my own careful judgment, rather than simply following a strict formula, trusting that I would handle the responsibility with the same patient fairness she had always seen in me. The total value of what she had built, between the savings bonds and the investment account, came to a little over $218,000, an amount that stunned me deeply, sitting there alone in that small, quiet bank room, holding her letter in my shaking hands. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than the simple facts of the money itself. I felt, first, an overwhelming rush of love and admiration for my mother, understanding, in a whole new way, the quiet strength and discipline it must have taken to build something this significant, all while living such a modest, unassuming daily life that neither of her own children ever suspected the truth. I felt, too, a deep, tender grief, wishing, more than almost anything, that I could speak with her directly one more time, to ask her all the questions I suddenly had about this hidden, careful chapter of her life. I sat alone in that small bank room for nearly an hour, long after I had finished reading her letter, simply holding the savings bond statements in my lap, thinking back over decades of memories that now looked slightly different to me, viewed through this new understanding. I thought about the coupons she clipped every single Sunday, sitting at her kitchen table with the newspaper spread out in front of her, something I had always assumed was simply an old habit from her childhood poverty, never once considering it might also be a deliberate, ongoing choice, made fresh every week, in service of something larger she was quietly building. I thought about the modest Christmas gifts she always gave, thoughtful but never expensive, and how I had sometimes, in less generous moments over the years, privately wished she would simply spend a little more freely on herself and on us. I felt a fresh wave of shame at that memory, understanding now what all that careful restraint had actually been in service of. I sat with this discovery for nearly 2 weeks before deciding how to move forward, wanting to be certain I approached the situation exactly the way my mother had trusted me to, with patience and fairness, rather than rushing into any quick decision. I met with Bartholomew Ashcroft, the financial advisor my mother had worked with, to fully understand the investment account and confirm the exact numbers involved. He explained that my mother had been a remarkably disciplined client over the years, consistently adding small, regular amounts to her investments, never once panicking during market downturns, always taking his advice with the same quiet, patient trust she seemed to bring to everything in her life. He told me, with obvious warmth in his voice, that she had often mentioned wanting to leave something meaningful behind for her children, something that would help ease their lives in ways she herself had never fully experienced growing up. Bartholomew shared one more thing with me that afternoon, something I have carried close to my heart ever since. He told me that during one of their earliest meetings, many years before, my mother had asked him a simple question, whether it was truly possible for someone with modest, ordinary means to build something meaningful over time, simply through patience and consistency, without any dramatic windfall or lucky break. He told her yes, that it absolutely was possible, and that patience, more than luck, was usually the deciding factor in whether ordinary savings grew into something significant. My mother, he said, had nodded slowly at that answer, and had never once wavered from her careful, disciplined approach in all the years that followed. I want to explain the decision I finally reached, because I think it reflects the trust my mother placed in me, and the careful thought I tried to bring to honoring that trust properly. I decided, after much thought, that the fairest path forward was a genuinely equal split between Halston and myself, exactly the kind of straightforward fairness I believed my mother would ultimately want, even though she had left the final judgment in my hands rather than dictating a strict formula herself. I did not believe it would be right or true to her wishes for me to use this discovery as any kind of leverage or advantage over my brother, even though he had no idea it existed. And even though his careless comment about our mother leaving nothing worth fighting over still stung, quietly, somewhere in my chest. I called Halston and asked him to meet me at our mother's house one more time, telling him only that I had something important to discuss, something related to finishing up our mother's affairs properly. I want to describe that conversation carefully, because I think it shows something important about how families can move through difficult surprises when approached with honesty and genuine care rather than anger or hidden resentment. We sat together at our mother's kitchen table, the same table where she had first told me about the safety deposit box 8 years earlier, and I explained everything to him, slowly and carefully. I told him about the hidden key inside the jewelry box lining. I told him about my visit to the bank, about the savings bonds and the investment account, about the letter our mother had written specifically to me, explaining her reasoning for keeping the whole matter private for so many years. Halston went very quiet as I explained all of this, his face moving through several different expressions in quick succession: surprise, confusion, and eventually, something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine shame. I said she left nothing worth fighting over, he finally said, his voice cracking slightly. Standing right here in this room, sorting through her things, treating it all like some tiring chore. And this whole time, she had actually built something significant, something she trusted you enough to handle carefully, because she knew, even then, that I might not have approached it the same patient way you would have. I don't think she doubted your love for her, I told him gently. I think she simply understood something true about how differently we each handle certain things, patience with slow, careful matters especially. She trusted me with this particular task because of that difference, not because she loved either of us more or less than the other. Why didn't you tell me right away, he asked, the moment you found it? You could have kept it all for yourself, honestly, and I would never have known any different. I thought carefully before answering, because I wanted him to understand something true about who I actually was, not just about what our mother had asked of me. Because that was never actually what Mom wanted, I told him. She trusted me to handle it fairly, and fair, to me, has always meant splitting this evenly between the two of us, exactly the way any inheritance should be handled between siblings who both loved her, in our own different ways. I was hurt by what you said in this room, Halston, more than I let you see at the time. But I was never going to let that hurt turn into something that betrayed what Mom actually trusted me to do. Halston was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I think, he said slowly, that I've spent my whole adult life assuming that value only looked like the things you could easily see and count right in front of you. A nice house. Visible savings. Something flashy enough to notice without having to look closely. I never once considered that our mother, quiet as she always was, might have been building something significant this whole time, simply because she never once let it show on the surface of her daily life. I told him I thought that was an honest and important thing to recognize about himself, and about how he had misjudged our mother, and perhaps me as well, for a very long time. We split the inheritance evenly, exactly as I had decided, working together with Bartholomew and a lawyer to make sure everything was handled properly and fairly. I want to explain, though, that the money itself, significant as it was, ended up mattering far less to me, in the end, than the conversation that grew out of discovering it. I remember, near the end of that first long conversation at the kitchen table, Halston asking me something that surprised me. Do you think she would be proud of how I'm handling this news? He asked, his voice smaller than I had heard it in years. Or do you think she'd be disappointed in me, for the comment I made, for not seeing any of this coming? I thought carefully before answering. I think I told him that Mom understood, better than either of us gave her credit for, exactly how complicated people can be. I don't think she expected either of us to be perfect. I think she simply hoped, in the end, that whatever mistakes we made along the way, we would find our way back to honesty and fairness with each other, the same way we're doing right now at this table. I think that would make her proud, Halston. Not the comment itself, but this conversation, right here, is exactly what she was hoping for. He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything else, simply sitting together in our mother's quiet kitchen, feeling the weight and the relief of finally understanding each other a little more fully. In the months that followed, Halston and I grew closer than we had been in many years, talking more openly about our mother, about our different childhood memories of her, about the ways we had each, in our own manner, misunderstood parts of who she truly was. He began visiting me more often, not out of any sense of guilt over the money, I believe, but out of a genuine, rekindled interest in understanding our shared family history more fully. The quiet chapters neither of us had ever fully appreciated while our mother was still alive to explain them herself. He used part of his share of the inheritance to finally take his own children on a trip our mother had always talked about wanting to take herself, but never quite managed, a visit to the small mountain town where she had grown up, so poor, all those decades earlier. He told me, after that trip, that standing in the small, modest house where our mother had spent her own childhood had finally helped him understand something important about her lifelong instinct toward careful, quiet saving. An instinct born not from stinginess, but from a deep, early lesson about the value of protecting yourself and the people you loved, patiently, invisibly, against whatever hard winters might eventually come. I kept my own share of the inheritance mostly untouched for the first several months, uncertain exactly how I wanted to honor it. Eventually, I decided to use part of it to establish a small scholarship fund, in our mother's name, at the local community college near where she had grown up, meant specifically to help young women from modest, working-class backgrounds pursue their education, the same kind of opportunity my mother herself had never fully had access to as a young girl. I remember the day the scholarship fund officially launched, standing in a small auditorium at the college, watching the first recipient, a quiet, hard-working young woman named Perpetua Alvarado, accept the award with tears in her eyes. She reminded me, in some small way, of my mother, careful and patient in how she spoke, clearly moved by an opportunity she had not expected to receive. I thought, standing there, about how strange and wonderful it was that my mother's quiet, invisible decades of saving had finally found their way, through this unexpected path, into helping build a future for a young woman she had never even met. Halston attended that ceremony with me, standing quietly beside me in the small auditorium, and afterward, he told me it was one of the proudest moments he had felt in a long time, watching our mother's name attached to something so meaningful, so aligned with who she had actually been underneath her quiet, modest daily life. I still have that small wooden jewelry box, sitting now on my own dresser, the same one Halston once dismissed as simply old furniture and jewelry that's probably not even real. I open it sometimes, running my fingers along the same small hidden flap of fabric where that key once lay concealed, and I think about my mother, quiet and patient her whole life, building something meaningful in the shadows while the rest of us assumed we already understood the full shape of who she was. I think, often, about that afternoon in her living room, the one where Halston said she had left nothing behind worth fighting over. I do not believe he meant real cruelty by it. I think he simply believed, honestly and without much examination, a story about our mother's life that had been sitting there, unquestioned, for years, because neither of us had ever thought to look closely enough beneath the modest, quiet surface she presented to the world. I have learned something important from all of this, something I try to remember even now. The people we love most do not always show us the full shape of who they are, or what they have quietly built, in ways that are easy to see from the outside. Sometimes the most significant things a person leaves behind are hidden carefully, patiently, waiting for the right moment and the right person to finally bring them into the light. I think, too, about how many other families might be living some version of this same quiet story right now without even realizing it. A parent who lived modestly, not out of simple necessity, but out of a private, deliberate discipline nobody around them ever thought to question. A grandmother whose small, careful habits over decades quietly built something far more meaningful than anyone in her family ever imagined. I think about how easy it is, in the business of ordinary daily life, to look at someone's quiet, unassuming way of living and assume we already understand the whole of who they are, without ever pausing to ask what might be sitting carefully underneath the surface. My mother taught me, across a lifetime of small, patient lessons and one final, quiet gift left behind in a metal box across town, that value does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, patient and steady, for exactly the right moment to be understood. If someone in your own family looked at a quiet, modest life and decided, without ever really asking, that there was nothing significant left behind to understand, what would you do? Would you simply accept that easy assumption, the way I nearly let myself accept it, sitting in that living room that difficult afternoon? Or would you finally do what I did and open the box, letting the full, quiet truth of a life well lived finally speak for itself?